small-scale, low-latitude fisheries, Arctic region, and coastal flooding were the ones that will have the greatest impacts that will be felt at 1.5 and at 2. Just to give a few more specific examples, we have coral reefs where before 1980 at 0.4 degree warming, there are no reports of mass bleaching. There's an isolated event around 1980 when we are also like at 0.5, but then as we rise, we can see the first events of global mass bleaching. If you see on the right-hand side, the gray bar, right where it says 1 degree, that is where we are currently. And we can see that there are already several events. And between 1.5 and 2, it would just get worse to the point where there will be mass bleaching and mortality events. Moving on to another example, there will also be impacts on terrestrial ecosystems, but if we compare back to what we saw with the coral at 1.5, there isn't as much as an impact, but there is a key transition between 1.5 and 2 due to the shifts in biomes. And just like in the previous case with the corals, by 2 and above with the biome shift, there might be species range losses. And then the adaptation options are going to be limited. In the third example, we always think that impacts to climate change are going to be harmful, but there are some cases and for certain regions of people that there will be some benefits. In this graphic, we can see, for example, with the increase in temperature, that the number of deaths due to cold and due to heat will change according to region. So while there will be increased heat death in Southeast Asia and in Southern Europe, for example, there will be decreased cold deaths in North America and South America. So here we can see the different shifts that there can be. There are some important regions missing, especially South Asia and Africa, due to the lack of epidemiological data, which also illustrates a major problem for lack of systematic global inventory of climate change impacts. So with all these impacts, we also have different adaptation needs and adaptation options. Adaptation needs will be lower at 1.5 C compared to 2 degree. Avoided impacts will be greater at 1.5 compared to 2. And I'm attaching here the definition of adaptation used in the report, which is consistent with what IPCC has used. As we move to 1.5 and then to 2, we are going to be needing to use incremental and transformational adaptation. As you can see in the previous bars going from 1.5 to 2, there will be some cases in which incremental adaptation will not longer be enough and we will need to be applying transformational adaptation. Incremental adaptation is adaptation that maintains the essence and integrity of a system or process. So we can think, for example, in agriculture, when we use climate-resistant crops, like drought-resistant, for example, that is considered incremental adaptation. But there will be cases in which these crop variations will not be sufficient anymore, and we will need to use transformational adaptation. In the case of agriculture, for example, it can mean changing crop type completely. For example, instead of growing maize or beans or soy to change to flowers or livestock. There are some examples in Nepal where communities have changed entirely, and instead of doing agriculture, they've gone to ecotourism. Transformational adaptation is then adaptation that changes the fundamental attributes of a socio-ecological system in anticipation of climate change and its impacts. And I'm just seeing that my slides have appeared and in a different order. So again, I'm not sure if you're seeing the adaptation, the incremental and transformational slide. So another example are, flood protections that you put in cities and new city planning safeguards of how you do more integral building. So I hope the next slide is on overarching adaptation options. Adaptation options vary by system, whether we're talking about infrastructure or ecosystems, livelihoods, but there are a series of adaptation options that go across all systems that are transversal, including community-based adaptation, disaster risk reduction, insurance and finance, climate services, indigenous knowledge, health systems and social safety nets, and migration. So now, moving on to greenhouse gas emission pathways, we have that to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C, CO2 emissions will need to fall by about 45% by 2030, and this is from 2010 levels. If we are talking about global temperatures at 2 degrees C, then the reduction will be 20. So here we can see the comparison of 45% and 20%. To limit warming to 1.5 C, CO2 emissions would need to reach net zero around 2050, compared to around 2075 for 2 degrees C. So here again we see 25 years. And then non-CO2 emissions will also need to be reduced and will primarily have direct and immediate health benefits. To limit warming to 1.5 C, we would require changes at an unprecedented scale that we have not seen to date. There will need to be deep emission cuts in all sectors. In the report, we have them as energy, industry, land and ecosystems, and urban. Talking about a range of technologies, also in all the above sectors, where there's going to need to be behavioral changes and an increased investment in low carbon options. Progress in renewable energy will need to be mirrored in other sectors, and we need to start thinking about removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Depending on what pathway we take, the use of CDR technologies will need to be used even more. Therefore, there will also be implications for food security, ecosystems, and biodiversity. As has been reported in the past, since countries have been submitting their pledges, the current pledges are not enough to limit warming to 1.5 C, and to avoid warming of more than 1.5 C, we would require emissions to reduce substantially by 2030, again by approximately 45%. So I hope you are all seeing right now figures SPM3A, in which we can see the global emissions pathways characteristics. The figure shows general characteristics of the evolution of anthropogenic net emissions of CO2. And on the right-hand side, we can see total emissions of methane, black carbon, and nitrous oxide in model pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 C with no or limited overshoot. So net emissions are defined as anthropogenic emissions reduced by anthropogenic removals. So the more we take to do the reduction of emissions, the more we will have to rely on CDR options. Reductions in net emissions can be achieved through different portfolios of mitigation measures illustrated in figure SPM3B, which I hope you are all seeing right now, in which we have 4 different pathways, P1, P2, P3, and P4, which shows different uses, different levels of use of carbon dioxide removal, of which we can see more in P4. and also on contributions of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BECS, and removals in the AFOLU, which is agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector. So if we can see, for example, in P1, we have scenario with high social. Okay, sorry. Now I can start seeing my slides, and I see that that the slides are very behind from where they should be. So right now you should see figure 3B, hopefully. Sorry about that. Again, I cannot see my slides on my screen, so I'm not exactly sure on what is being presented right now. Anyways, I hope you're seeing SPM 3B, in which P1 shows a scenario in which we have high social and behavioral changes that businesses and industry have become very sustainable with very low energy demand, high use of renewable energy. And as we move to P2 and P3, we can see that although there are still sustainable characteristics and energy efficiency, technology innovation, P3 and P4 have a considerable greater percentage of CDR and VEX. So again, the more we see on carbon dioxide removal, the more we'll have to start thinking on what the other on what the implications are with other objectives. So in order to assess which options are the best, we did a feasibility of options and systems transitions. Mitigation and adaptation options are assessed along 6 dimensions, seen here: environmental, technological, economic, social, cultural, institutional, and geophysical. And we're looking mainly at, the questions that we were trying to answer is, where should a policymaker look first for quick wins, and what barriers need to be overcome? Also looking not only at the feasibility of specific options, but also looking at the synergies and trade-offs that exist between mitigation and adaptation, and then with sustainable development. So if we look here, starting with mitigation, the darker the cell color is it means it's highly feasible. Medium color is medium feasibility, and the lighter color is low feasibility. And in the squares that are white, it means that it's not applicable. It's not applicable, or there is no limited or no evidence. This appears in Chapter 4 of the report and in the supplemental material of Chapter 4. So here we can see for just a handful of emissions, since there were about 30 options assessed. But here we can see that solar PV is applicable to all the different scenarios. That power sector, CO2 capture and storage and VEX are more applicable to P3 and P4 scenarios. Afforestation and reforestation, AFOLU, are more prominent for P1 and P2, and low and zero energy buildings are more applicable to the P1 scenario. So here we can see, and what was also stated during the launch, that the different options assessed are scientifically, technologically, physically, within the laws of science, applicable, and their feasibility depends mostly on governments and societies, which cannot be easily assessed. And we did the same here for the different adaptation options, in which, just as a few examples, for land and ecosystem transitions in urban and infrastructure, we see, for example, that green infrastructure and ecosystem services has high feasibility in 3 of the dimensions, while, for example, efficient irrigation has medium feasibility across all the dimensions. The context column shows what were the contexts that were in the literature assessed for each option. So for example, community-based adaptation, the literature was mainly focused on rural areas and in case studies combined with ecosystems-based adaptation, but does not include urban setting. This does not mean that CBA does not apply for urban areas, but that the bulk of the literature is focused on rural areas. So for each of the option, you can see the context under which it was assessed. But the feasibility assessment alone is not enough for the implementation of these both mitigation and adaptation options. There are a series of critical enabling conditions. Amongst them, we have finance and investment, and where we will need an additional 2.5% finance overall, and which implies a considerable redirection from fossil to low emissions. There also needs to be policy, instrumentation, and institutional capacity at all levels. We're not only talking about government here, but also subnational and non-state actors. There needs to be improved governance, which is the ability to cooperate across actors. Behavioral change, which also includes public support. This also means that actions to get to 1.5 C can also be taken at the individual and community levels, that each one of us has a very important role to play in achieving this goal. And lastly, we have technological innovations. So just as a few examples, for behavioral changes in social cultural feasibility of adaptation, it can help with farmer decision making and building design, water conservation, and the role of incentives. For technology, innovation and feasibility, some of the options include precision agriculture, smart homes and cities, and early warning systems. And here we can also see in some of the examples like smart cities that these options apply both to mitigation and adaptation. So some of the options were assessed both on the mitigation and adaptation side, also to see where are the major gaps in information and where we can have increased synergies. For economic stability and adaptation finance specifically, the needs in developing countries are up to $300 billion per year. And currently adaptation is less than 18 to 25% of the financial flows. One word of caution here is that the report does not provide cost estimates for adaptation or compare 1.5 C and 2 degrees, the cost comparison between 1.5 and 2. The other thing to keep in mind is that all these different options are implemented based on specific contexts. So even though, for example, going back to the adaptation assessments, talking, for example, of community-based adaptation, the way this will be implemented and the scale will depend upon the context of each country, region, or even regions within countries. And the same could be said for every other option. So strengthening the global response in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty includes that we think of climate change and people, and closely linking to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and not only specifically to the Sustainable Development Goals, but to sustainable development in general. As we can see, the mix of measures to adapt to climate change and to reduce emissions can have multiple benefits for sustainable development. There could also be trade-offs for which the feasibility assessment can also help us point to. To strengthen this response, we also need national, subnational authorities and civil society, private sector, indigenous people, local communities to support ambitious action. and also indicating that international cooperation is a critical part of limiting warming to 1.5 C. So as a main conclusion, several key messages from the summary for policymakers is that, again, we need to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030, which means that we require transformative systemic change integrated with sustainable development. It needs the upscaling and acceleration of the implementation of far-reaching multi-level and cross-sectoral climate mitigation and addressing barriers. And such systemic changes across all sectors need to be linked with complementary adaptation actions, including transformational adaptation. As we can see, in some cases, incremental adaptation will not be enough, especially for pathways that temporarily overshoot 1.5 degrees. We also see that we need to implement a mix of mitigation and adaptation options, that there need to be implemented in a participatory and integrated manner, enabling rapid systemic transitions both in urban and rural areas. And these are necessary elements for an accelerated transition towards 1.5 C world. These options and changes are most effective when they are aligned with economic and sustainable development, and when local and regional governments are supported by national governments. So this means not only that we need to implement both mitigation and adaptation, but even mitigation options, including just, for example, renewable energy technologies, will need to keep in mind the future impacts of climate change and be robust enough, resilient enough for future impacts. So even then, for each option, we need to consider what adaptation options they need to include. There is also increasing evidence suggesting that a climate-sensitive realignment of savings and expenditure towards low-emission, climate-resilient infrastructure and services requires an evolution of global and national financial systems. So there needs to be an increase in how financial flows work, both for mitigation and adaptation. And again, remembering that to achieve 1.5 C mitigation, that is emissions reductions alone is not enough. That adaptation needs to be considered, including for the different mitigation options. So I know I went a bit fast, and at some points I was a bit lost here again because I couldn't see my slides. But I hope this was clear, and right now I'm open to any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And there are, of course, a lot of questions here. We have some of our colleagues who are seated who would like to ask questions, but please be checking the chat column because I see a lot of people online, and I believe they ask questions from that point too. So, guys, if anybody has a question. But my first question I would like to ask is how involved is Africa in some of these reports? Normally, it does appear these whole processes are being undertaken at the European or advanced country level, and then Africa just gets to read it. How far or how involved are African countries in such reports?
You are right. The bulk of the
Okay.
output are from North America and Europe, but this
All right.
this increased participation
Probably somebody would like to ask a
African. One of
question on
the
this, if
coordinating
anybody else.
authors is African from Botswana, and there were about 4 African
Okay, Jenny, Debbie, sorry. Let me also make mention of the fact
there
that
are, and we can
you
take that
spoke
also
about, in your summary, you talk about increasing evidence
country.
that suggests that climate sensitivity alignment. I don't know what basically you are referring to, and if you could throw more light on that aspect. In your summary, increasing evidence on climate change.
Oh, increasing evidence. Okay, let me go back to that slide. Suggests that climate-sensitive realignment of savings and expenditure towards low emission, climate resilient infrastructure. It basically talks about that there needs to be more financing for low emission and climate resilient infrastructure, and that savings and expenditure need to be realigned towards these technologies. So it talks about how there needs to be an evolution of global and national financial
Okay,
system, and
so
just in general,
we have someone who wants to ask a question.
to work for globalization.
Thank you. I am Damasen. I want to ask the question about the energy efficiency and the climate change. So, in the report, I didn't see the effect of energy efficiency in mitigating climate change.
Energy efficiency will play a role in the four pathways mentioned, and which I hope you're all seeing on the screen right now. The degree of how energy efficiency is applied throughout all the pathways change, but energy efficiency is one of the options that were assessed, and that would be before, of course, at a major degree in P1.
Okay,
By 2050, but also
I think maybe we have another question.
which would see the main one, because the P4 scenario is where we still see resource and energy intensive.
Yes, there are questions in the chat, so maybe you can answer.
Greater percentage in the need in the use
I'm going to call around
of
to
BECS and CER.
chat.
Did that answer your question, Hap?
Chat.
Yeah, I see a question in the chat from. Yeah, there's a question in the chat from Lewis. What do you think are the hardest challenges to overcome for achieving a 1.5C scenario? Hello? In the next 5 years? I think the biggest. Yes, I just read the one of Lewis. What do you think are the hardest challenges to overcome for achieving a 1.5C scenario in the next 5 years. And in the next 5 years, we're going to need to see a rapid transformation that's quite unprecedented, to the rate that we haven't seen right now. We need to see also a better understanding of the differences between 1.5 and 2. In other forums, we've heard that this concept of 1.5 and 2 sometimes appears abstract. I think one of the challenges is also
what happened with the sound?
Each individual is involved, and that collectively. Hello? Can you hear me? And that collectively we need to start taking different actions.
Can't hear.
So
We can't hear him. Ha.
Yeah, you continue.
I see that, Louis, I hope that answered your question. I have another one from Sarah. How is this report going to be accessible to everyone to increase awareness on climate, especially in Africa? Right now on the IPCC website, you can see the report, specifically the summary for policymakers and the last version of all the chapters. Right now, it is still going under production and to fit the official format of the IPCC. So that will be available shortly, and also the summary for policymakers and the glossary are being translated to the different official UN languages. But for now, both the SPM, the summary for policymakers, and the different chapters are existing. To what extent can a research institute like ours benefit in working with IPCC on future reports? As you all might know, IPCC does an assessment of the current literature. IPCC does not create new science or knowledge. It assesses what there is to date. So the role of research institutes of universities is in the production of knowledge, because whatever is published, both peer-reviewed grade literature, also grade literature, are assessed by IPCC, and those inputs are important for the results of the different assessments. Researchers can also be involved as lead authors, as expert reviewers, and as review editors. So there are many roles to be played within IPCC. Let's see, what measures are put in place to ensure that the emission could be reduced by 45% as suggested? As mentioned, and also when I was referring to Louis's question of what are the biggest challenges, is that the biggest changes need to happen now, because we have up to 2030 to reduce emissions by 45% in order to be on a pathway that does not take us to an overshoot. So the measures would need to be put in place, includes finance and policy and governments. As you know, this report will also feed into the COP24 in Katowice, the Poland Climate Summit. So this document will be used by the countries to see where we are and what options they have to ratchet up their different commitments. So again, the options assessed are scientifically, like if we talk about physically and technologically, they are feasible, but what we cannot assess is the pace and how governments and people will respond to them, which also, it goes back to the category we had on behavioral changes. That is how everybody is, the role that each individual and community plays in achieving this. There's another question: does renewable energy provide solutions to climate change? And the answer is yes. However, having 100% renewable energy for electricity generation does not lead us to 1.5. So renewable energy alone is not sufficient, but it does play an important role both for electricity generation within sustainable cities and communities, and also for the use in industry, because again, the different options assessed are implemented, would need to be implemented across all the different sectors. What measures can households put in place to mitigate climate change in respect to this report? In respect to this report, and these are just a subset of the options, we have the low and zero energy buildings. We also go back to the question of energy efficiency. That energy efficiency, actions just as simple as turning the lights off when you leave a room will help a lot and will help in reducing energy demand. I think there also needs to be behavioral changes in terms of, especially and I'm not talking about everybody, but there are some contexts in which drastic reductions in meat consumption need to be implemented. And I want to clarify here that when I talk about drastic reductions in meat consumption, there are communities, especially rural, but not limited to rural, that depend on meat consumption for their livelihood. So of course this recommendation is not a blanket one, but there does need to be a reduction in meat consumption. So these are actions that can be taken at the level of households. But also, it's not just on energy demand, like an electricity demand, but also in how we use water and how we use our resources. That we're not so consumption intensive, so to speak. It appears such policy documents does not reflect needed action at the local levels. What makes this new report different from previous documents? Well, this 1.5C report is quite different in various senses. First of all, IPCC has 3 different working groups, which talks about the physical basis of climate change, the science behind it. Working group 2, which is on impacts and vulnerability, and number 3, which is on mitigation. So this is the first report that brings together the three working groups. It's also different in that this was requested by the Paris Agreement through the UNFCCC. So this was a specific request, unlike the different assessment reports that are published. But also because 1.5C appeared within the Paris Agreement as of high priority and importance for developing countries and very vulnerable, the most vulnerable countries and LDCs. So there are areas, actually, when you look, for example, in chapters 3, 4, and 5. In chapters 3, there talks about impacts at all levels. In chapter 4, we have assessments on, for example, indigenous knowledge and how community-based adaptation and ecosystems-based adaptation and ecosystems restoration affect or can help rural areas. And then, of course, when we go to chapter 5 and we see the whole linkage with sustainable development, one of the main goals is to ensure poverty eradication and ensure there is equity. So in this sense, this document is different because it reflects more on the local levels, both in urban and rural areas. But there is also something to keep in mind that local participation is needed to achieve 1.5C, which is another reason why we're highlighting this, which is another reason why we emphasize that actions taken at the individual and community level are going to be very important to reach 1.5. We have another question here. How does this predicted climatic change impact on forest reserves, especially for the country of Kenya? Chapter 3 talks about the different impacts. There are going to be the forestry sectors, and including all ecosystems, will be more affected at 2 degrees than at 1.5 C. And I can get you more specific information by email on Kenya. Here, if you see in my last slide, is my email address. So Hillary, if you could please send me an email, I can get back to you with information specific.
Hello? You hear me? Is it possible?
Yes.
Yes. What do you think about carbon taxes? It was a temporary solution about with under country and developing country. Was it a good idea or no? What about this?
Hello? Yes? Yes. In the report, this would again appear in
Can you repeat
chapter
the
4.
answer because we couldn't hear you quite clearly?
You repeat the question?
You can't reply.
So it will be playing a role in achieving 1.5.
I think we've had enough of the reports today, and just as you said, we would direct our colleagues and any other person online to try download the full reports from the IPCC website. So without wasting much time, Debbie would like to thank you for your time, for the detailed summarized version of the 2018 report, and we look forward to having another session with you sometime to come. And as you highlighted your email, I believe if any other participant online or physically here has any concerns, he or she can send you an email, right? Okay.
Yes. Please send me an email.
All right, so on behalf of the staff of Powers here in Clemson, Algeria, and our Climate and Gender Club, and any other person online, we thank you so much for your time, and then we look forward, just as I said, having another session with you sometime to come. So bye for now, and we'll get in touch again.
Updated news on the 1.5 report.
Oh,